The plane did not fall from the sky. It landed in the rain, on the runway, exactly where it was supposed to. And that is what makes this story so terrifying, because in less than half a minute, that ordinary landing became the deadliest air disaster in Latin American history. So, what stole the runway from them after they had already survived the flight? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The plane did not fall from the sky, it landed. That is what still chills the blood. On a rainy evening in São Paulo, an Airbus came down where it was supposed to, on the runway it was cleared for, under a sky that looked ugly but survivable. No midair breakup, no explosion in the clouds, just wheels, concrete spray, and then a city waiting below. So the question that pulls us in is not how it crashed. The question is, how did it touch down and still not stop? On July 17th, 2007, TAM Flight 3054 flew from Porto Alegre to Congonhas Airport in São Paulo. By the end of that night, 199 people were dead, 187 in the aircraft and 12 on the ground. For Brazil and for South America, it became the deadliest air disaster on record. The fire burned so fiercely that it marked not only an avenue and a building, but also the memory of a whole country that had already been living in fear of aviation. And when a tragedy reaches that size, people start begging for a simple answer. They want one villain they can point at with a shaking finger: the pilot, the runway, the airline, the rain, the machine. But this story does not belong to one culprit alone. It belongs to a chain made of stress, poor timing, a dangerous airport, a tiny cockpit mistake, and warnings that had already been spoken before the dead had names. The land had been whispering. The system kept pretending it could not hear. To understand that night, we have to step back and listen to Brazil in those years. The country was moving more people by air than its infrastructure could handle gracefully. Flight demand had been climbing fast. Airports were old, towers were stretched, delays spread through the network like a fever through a crowded house. Passengers were angry, crews were worn thin, and other recent disasters had already bruised trust in the aviation system. The sky was still open, yes, but it was no longer calm. Then came the collapse of Varig, one of the great old names in Brazilian aviation. When that space opened, other airlines rushed to fill it, and TAM grew hard and fast. From a distance, growth looks like triumph. Up close, it can look like training departments sprinting, schedules swallowing margins, and workers carrying more than they were designed to carry. Expansion is glamorous in a boardroom. In a cockpit, expansion can feel like being asked to build the bridge while the bus is already crossing it. Pilots felt that strain in their bodies. They dealt with delays, crowded terminals, angry travelers, and a company culture that did not always meet pressure with support. In those days, some TAM pilots were expected to stand outside the cockpit during boarding and greet passengers, a gesture meant to soften public anger, but that also exposed crews to abuse and diverted time from the pre-flight routine. It was the kind of corporate idea that sounds warm on paper and cold in real life. So by the time Flight 3054 entered the story, nobody in that ecosystem was starting fresh. Everyone was already carrying something: a delay, a complaint, a backlog, a fear. And then there was Congonhas, the airport at the heart of the route map and the center of a quiet dread. If you look at it from above, it almost seems like a dare. A busy runway lay inside a city that had grown up around it until there was barely room left for mercy. Congonhas is in the middle of São Paulo, where business wanted it and geography punished it. The airport was valuable because it was close to the city's pulse. That same closeness made it dangerous. Tall buildings, steep embankments, traffic, fuel, concrete, neighborhoods, no generous space at the ends. The main runway, runway 35 left and 17 right, was only 1,945 meters long. For modern jet traffic in rain, there is not much forgiveness. It is a narrow promise. And the danger was not only length, it was texture. Pilots had long complained that the runway became slippery when wet. Water could pool where it should have drained away. Rubber met pavement and found less grip than it trusted. That matters because a runway is not just a strip of black ground. It is a contract between speed and friction. When water starts editing that contract, the airplane arrives with less truth under its wheels than the crew believes is there. The airport authorities had tried different fixes over time, but the problem kept returning. So in 2007, the runway was resurfaced. That should have been a relief. But one of the most important pieces was still missing when it reopened: the grooves. Those narrow cuts in the pavement are there to help water escape, so the tires stay in contact with something honest instead of skating over a thin sheet of rain. Without grooves, a fresh runway can still behave like polished stone under oil. And still, the runway reopened on June 29th, 2007, before those grooves were cut. That decision has hovered over this story ever since, like a second storm cloud. There were also questions about oversight, certification, and the extent of the authorities' real safety control over the country's busiest airport. Worse, a rule had been drafted that would have required jetliners landing at Congonhas to have both thrust reversers available. The rule existed in spirit, it simply had not been fully carried into life. The runway did not wait for bureaucracy to catch up. The day before Flight 3054, an ATAR-42 landed at Congonhas in light rain, hydroplaned, slid off the runway, hit obstacles, and sustained significant damage. Everyone survived, but the message was clear enough for anyone who still respected omens. The runway was speaking loudly now. Wet surface, poor grip, narrow escape. The city had just been given a rehearsal of what might happen if a larger aircraft met the same conditions with less luck. Now, let us move south to Porto Alegre on the evening of July 17th. Two TAM pilots arrived after a short flight from São Paulo and began preparing for the return leg. It was a quick turnaround, the kind airline crews do all the time, one routine folding into another so quickly that the day can start feeling like one long corridor with fluorescent lights. Their aircraft was a 9-year-old Airbus A320, not ancient, not broken beyond use, but not the kind of machine you describe as pristine. In the left seat was Captain Henrique Stefanini di Sacco, 53 years old, highly experienced, a man known for his care and seriousness, someone who read the fine print and liked to understand the systems he flew. The records also suggest he could be a little slower under pressure, the sort of pilot whose caution was usually a strength until a moment arrived that punished hesitation. In aviation, personality is not decoration. It becomes part of the machine the instant the engines start breathing. In the right seat sat Kleber Aguiar Lima, 54, also a captain and a veteran aviator in the broad sense, but much newer to the Airbus. He had far fewer hours on the A320 than the man flying. And that detail matters. Two captains in one cockpit is not unheard of, but it can create a strange dance. Each is used to command, each has habits, each carries authority. Yet one must now monitor, challenge, catch, and sometimes correct the other with perfect timing and no wounded pride. That arrangement becomes even more delicate when the captain in the right seat is not yet deeply seasoned in that specific aircraft from that specific seat. Airplanes are not only learned through manuals, they are learned through muscle memory, angles of view, where your hand falls without thinking, and what catches your eye first when trouble begins. Sit a pilot on the side, he uses less. In a roll, he uses less. Inside a tense arrival, and the margin for instant diagnosis becomes thinner than the passengers below will ever know. The training picture behind that cockpit was not ideal, even converting pilots quickly onto the Airbus fleet while also growing fast. There was classroom instruction, yes, but the rhythm of practical training and cockpit procedure work did not always match the deeper preparation one would want in a fragile system. None of that guarantees disaster, but it raises the background risk. It makes a crew more likely to carry unresolved habits, vague assumptions, and differences in technique into a moment that demands a single language and a single rhythm. Then there was the maintenance note already waiting in the logbook. The right thrust reverser was inoperative. Let us make that simple. A thrust reverser is a system that, after landing, helps redirect engine airflow so part of the engine's breath pushes against the aircraft's forward motion. It is not the only thing that slows a plane, but it helps. On this Airbus, the right side reverser had been deactivated days earlier after a fault. Maintenance had not repaired it. Instead, the airplane was legally released with that limitation noted. That point is important because people often hear inoperative thrust reverser and imagine a flying coffin. It was not that. Airliners can often land safely without one reverser because braking does not come from a single source. Tires, wheel brakes, lift reduction from the wings, runway condition, speed, and crew handling all share the work. The problem was not that this aircraft should never have flown. The problem was that one known limitation was being carried into one of the least forgiving runways in the country on a rainy night. Earlier that same day, the crew had already flown the aircraft with that condition and landed without incident. So the inoperative reverser would not have looked like a red siren on its own. It would have looked manageable. Annoying, yes. Worth attention, yes. But manageable. That is how danger often enters. Not dressed like doom. Dressed like one more item on a list professionals believe they can handle. And most days, they are right. It only takes one night for manageable to become a trap. The load sheet added one more stone to the crew's mental baggage. The flight was full, and the aircraft carried extra fuel because fuel was cheaper in Porto Alegre and the company had a habit of taking advantage of that. Even so, the landing calculations still fit within the allowed numbers for Congonhas. So this was not a case of a reckless airplane beyond limits. On paper, it could be done, but on paper, runways do not shine with rain, and cities do not wait beyond the embankment with open arms. The weather in São Paulo was poor, but still legal. Light rain, low cloud, reduced visibility, though not enough to forbid the approach. Winds generally favor the runway in use. A sad-looking evening, not an impossible one. In airline life, that kind of weather is precisely what creates pressure, because it is serious enough to demand respect, but ordinary enough that nobody wants to be the one who blinks too early. Diversions cost money, create headlines, and ripple through a system that was already sick with delays. At about 5:19 in the afternoon, the Airbus pushed away and departed Porto Alegre. The takeoff itself was ordinary. Shortly after, however, the crew received word that Congonhas had been temporarily closed because of runway conditions. Then, not long after, it reopened. That is a small detail on paper, but inside a pilot's head it lands differently. It says the runway ahead is so uncertain that operations are being paused and restarted around the ring. It tells you the ground under your future wheels is already part rumor, part test. The flight continued, climbing toward cruise, but the air along the way was rough. The crew encountered turbulence and areas of storm activity, prompting a request for route adjustments. Workload creeps upward in ways passengers do not always see. A bump here, a weather cell is there, another radio call, another correction, another little slice of attention shaved away. By the time an aircraft nears its destination, the crew may look composed, and often they are. But composition is not the same as being untouched by what came before. And hanging over all of it was the quiet understanding that diversions were not always welcomed by airline management. Nobody needed to say it directly in the cockpit for it to exist. Pilots learn very quickly what kind of decisions a company treats as prudent and what kind it treats as inconvenient. Even when safety remains the official flag, operational culture can still lean on the crew's shoulders like a hand that shouldn't be there. In a strained system, continuing often feels more natural than stopping to rethink. The cockpit voice recorder only captured the last part of the flight, so we do not have the full briefing from earlier in the descent. But what the final minutes do reveal is enough to show the captain's mind circling the same threat. He asked about the runway conditions several times. He reminded his colleague that they would be landing with one thrust reverser out. At one point, he mentioned a headache. Small human detail, perhaps. Yet these are the crumbs that let us see stress gathering before the impact. As the aircraft was vectored toward the ILS approach to runway 35 left, everything still looked orderly from a technical standpoint. The aircraft intercepted the guidance, descended steadily, remained stabilized, fully configured for the runway, and satisfied the checklist discipline expected in a professional operation. This is one of the darkest aspects of the whole case. The approach was not wild, it was not messy. From the outside, the scene looked disciplined. The danger was nesting somewhere smaller, quieter, and much more intimate. Then came the tower report the captain had been dreading. The runway was wet and slippery. He repeated the words back with clear tension in his voice. It is not hard to imagine why. The captain knew Congonhas. He knew the aircraft was heavy. He knew one reverser was unavailable. He very likely knew about the ATAR overrun from the day before. So when he heard wet and slippery, he did not hear ordinary weather. He received confirmation that the runway remained dangerous. Somewhere in those final minutes, a decision is formed in the captain's mind. To understand it, we have to go into a technical detail, but we will do so. Years earlier, when an Airbus landed with one thrust reverser unavailable, pilots had often used an older technique. They would bring the power back and then move only the working side into reverse. Later, that procedure was changed. Why? Because previous accidents had shown that splitting the levers that way could tempt the human hand into a fatal mix-up. The newer logic was safer for people because it reduced the chances of leaving one thrust lever where it did not belong. But the older method carried a seductive rumor. Some pilots believed it preserved a little more stopping margin on slippery runways. Not a huge miracle, just a little, a few precious meters. And when you are aiming at Congonhas in the rain, with a city waiting beyond the end, a few meters can swell in the mind until they feel like the difference between honor and horror. So here is the cruel possibility the evidence points toward. The captain may have chosen the older, unofficial handling style, not because he was careless, but because he was trying to be extra careful in the wrong direction. He may have thought he was buying more runway. That is how fear misleads even skilled people. It does not always whisper madness. Sometimes it whispers a practical shortcut that feels intelligent inside the exact mood of the moment. The trap hides inside reasoning that almost sounds noble. Now keep your eye on one object because the whole story will soon shrink down to it. One small metal lever. Not the whole cockpit, not the whole city. One lever. On the Airbus, the thrust levers do not work like a simple gas pedal in a car. The pilots place them in detents, little notches that define a thrust range, and the aircraft's automatic systems manage the exact engine power within that range. On approach, both levers were set to climb to maintain the proper speed. That arrangement is normal in Airbus flying, but it has a hidden psychological effect. Because the levers do not visibly dance with every power change, they can slip out of a pilot's immediate visual story. The engines may be working, the auto thrust may be adjusting, and the levers still sit there in their chosen notch like little statues. So when something goes wrong during landing, the hands and eyes do not always rush back to them first. That matters. In a few seconds, it would matter terribly. The aircraft crossed the threshold of runway 35 left at about 6:54 in the evening. The radio altimeter counted down 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. And then the standard Airbus voice, retard, retard, the reminder to bring the power levers back to idle for landing. The main wheels touched down inside the touchdown zone. From the cabin, it might have felt like a firm but ordinary arrival on a wet runway. Nothing theatrical, nothing that told the passengers their fate had already tilted. At that instant, the captain reached for the levers. He pulled the left one back to idle and then into reverse, commanding reverse thrust on the side that still worked. But the right lever, the one associated with the engine whose reverser was inoperative, remained in the climb to 10. That was the small betrayal, not an explosion, not a warning light screaming from the heavens, a hand movement incomplete by inches, the exact kind of human slip that earlier changed the procedure that had been tried to prevent it. From there, the Airbus began obeying a bad set of instructions with perfect discipline, and machines are merciless precisely because they are disciplined. The ground spoilers, panels on top of the wings that rise after touchdown to dump lift, did not deploy. Let us say that plainly. Without those spoilers, the wings keep producing more lift than you want, which means the airplane does not settle its full weight onto the landing gear. It is rolling on the runway, yes, but part of it is still trying to be a bird. That missing weight on the wheels cripples braking. The wheel brakes may be commanded, but they cannot bite with the same force if the aircraft is still half light on its feet. The auto brakes, which normally help apply smooth, immediate braking right after touchdown, were also denied their proper cue. So in a single small handling error, two major allies in the stopping process were quietly removed. The airplane had landed, but it had not fully entered the ground logic that turns a fast arrival into a controlled stop. And then came the final cruelty. Because the left lever was moved into reverse, the automatic thrust system dropped out. That meant the right engine now followed the actual position of the right lever more directly. But that lever was still sitting in climb. So while the left side helped slow the airplane, the right side was still pushing forward. One engine was trying to pull the aircraft back, the other was still urging it onward. The jet was no longer merely fast, it was arguing with itself. The cockpit did not receive the kind of clear, unmistakable warning that might have cut through the confusion in time. The aircraft had not been equipped with a later warning enhancement that could have made the bad lever position more obvious during the landing roll. So instead of one blunt message naming the true problem, the crew faced scattered clues. A missing spoiler response, weak deceleration, strange handling, a drift is beginning to build. The truth was present, but it did not arrive wearing a single bright label. Then came one of the most haunting phrases in modern aviation. The pilot monitoring called out that reverse was operating on the left side only, and then he said, in the language of the cockpit, that the spoilers were nothing. No spoilers, no lift dump, no proper transfer of weight. It is such a small sentence, almost dry, almost mechanical, and yet inside it, you can hear the runway length suddenly shrinking. You can hear the city below beginning to move toward them, even though it has not yet entered the windshield. At first, the captain seems to have interpreted the poor landing as what he expected most that night, aquaplaning on the wet Congonhas runway. That makes emotional sense. The surface had a reputation. The day before had already proven it could betray a landing aircraft. The tower itself had warned them, so the captain fought the problem that seemed most obvious. He worked the brakes. He fought for directional control. He tried to save the airplane with force, which is exactly what most human beings would try first. But force was not enough, because the deeper wound was logical, not muscular. The spoilers were still down. The automatic braking help was not there. The right engine was still carrying forward thrust. The aircraft drifted left due to asymmetric forces, while the captain tried to counter it with rudder and braking. Those actions were not irrational. They were arriving inside a puzzle that had not yet been named correctly, And on a runway, untimed truth is often no better than ignorance. Seconds are a currency there. The man in the right seat was responsible for monitoring, catching, and diagnosing. But think about what he faced. Darkness in the cockpit, a wet runway. An aircraft is already decelerating poorly. A captain under visible stress in the left seat. An unusual two-captain dynamic. Limited experience in the Airbus monitoring role. And a technical trap that required noticing one small lever position while everything in the body screamed that the real emergency was the speed, the slide, the line of lights running away under the windows. Later analysis suggested that if the crew had recognized the lever misposition very quickly, there might still have been time to stop on the runway. That is the kind of detail that breaks your heart because it tells you the story did not seal itself at touchdown. It sealed itself in the next handful of seconds while the crew tried to understand the wrong problem first. In aviation, 6 or 7 seconds can be an eternity when you are listening. They can be nothing at all when you are drowning in interpretation. The Airbus kept sliding through the wet night, still fast, still drifting left. The runway edge lights passed, the grass arrived. Then the aircraft crossed the taxiway and rushed toward the end with far too much energy still in its body. Imagine that view from above now. A city airport perched over a major avenue. A jet no longer obeying the script of landing. A few final meters of pavement, then the embankment, then the open mouth of São Paulo below, bright with headlights and evening life. The aircraft went off the end, became briefly airborne beyond the embankment, crossed over Washington Louis Avenue, and crashed into the TAM Express cargo building beside a fuel station. The impact destroyed the airplane. The fire did the rest. All 187 people aboard were killed. 12 people in the building and on the ground also died. It happened so fast that a routine domestic arrival became a national trauma before many families even realized the flight was no longer simply late. Firefighters battled the blaze through the night and beyond. The wreckage burned with a violence that made recovery painfully difficult. Families waited for names, for confirmations, for fragments of certainty in a situation where even the dead had been made hard to identify. This is the part a cold technical summary can betray, because behind every procedural flaw were people who had packed bags, kissed foreheads, answered messages, rushed through work, promised to call on arrival, and stepped into an evening they thought belonged to tomorrow. And do not forget the people on the ground. They did not board an airplane. They did not agree to the risk. They were in a building, in offices, near a roadway, living ordinary city, time beneath a runway whose margins had long been too narrow for the traffic it carried. Their deaths widened the moral shadow of the accident. This was not only an aviation catastrophe, it was also the story of what happens when urban density and thin safety margins meet a failure at exactly the wrong point. In the hours after the crash, people hunted for a clean explanation. Some wanted it to be only the pilots, others wanted it to be only the runway, as if concrete alone had seized the jet and dragged it forward. Some wondered if the aircraft had suffered a mysterious electronic rebellion. That hunger for one neat answer is understandable. Grief likes shapes, but the evidence left behind does not offer a neat answer. It offers layers, each ugly enough on its own, fatal only when braided together. The direct trigger was the captain leaving the right thrust lever in the climb position during landing. That is the central fact, and it cannot be politely hidden. But that fact is not the whole truth. It sits inside a much larger frame. The crew was under heavy stress. The airport was notoriously unforgiving. The runway surface had recent public warnings attached to it. The aircraft had one reverser inoperative. The company had grown faster than its culture and training discipline should have grown. The cockpit pairing mattered too. Two captains can work beautifully together, but they require a clean agreement about roles and a monitoring rhythm that feels natural. Here, the monitoring pilot had much less Airbus time, was sitting in the right seat, and faced the hardest kind of challenge a monitor can face, diagnosing a subtle technical miscue while the airplane is already moving fast through consequences. By the time authority, experience, and understanding align, the runway may have run out of its generosity. Records from other flights also suggested a broader standardization issue. Different crews had been using different techniques to land the aircraft with one inoperative reverser. That is not a trivial detail. It means the fatal handling choice may not have been a strange improvisation born in a single man's head on a single night. It may have been part of a wider drift, the kind that develops when procedure is not guarded fiercely enough and experienced people begin trusting what feels workable over what is formally standardized. Then there is the airport and the regulator. Congonhas should never have been treated like a place where half measures were acceptable. The runway had a slippery reputation. It reopened without the grooves that would have helped water escape. The safety margins beyond the pavement were brutally small. A stricter rule regarding thrust reversers had already been considered and not fully implemented. The system knew enough to be worried, but not enough to stop itself. That is a particularly modern kind of failure, bureaucratic and intimate at once. This is where the easy, sensational versions of the story begin to fail. Some people still prefer the narrative of sabotage, or hidden machine malice, or some dark secret beyond human comprehension. But that kind of storytelling often insults the truth that local pilots, workers, and families had been living with for months. The danger here was not invisible magic. It was visible neglect, visible pressure, visible friction problems, and visible operational strain. Conspiracy stories can feel dramatic, but they often erase the intelligence of those who warned us first. The real horror is more grounded and more insulting. The runway had been speaking, pilots had been speaking, the previous day's overrun had been speaking, the procedures had been speaking. Earlier accidents elsewhere had already spoken about the exact risk of splitting the thrust levers the wrong way. Yet all those voices remained separate long enough for one flight crew on one wet night to carry the full weight of what had not been resolved. That is not a mystery. That is accumulated debt coming due rapidly. And that is why this tragedy belongs to more than aviation enthusiasts. It belongs to anyone who has watched a system normalize warning signs because none of them alone seem large enough to stop business as usual. A slippery runway becomes an inconvenience. Thin training becomes a growing pain. A stressed crew becomes part of the job. A temporary closure becomes a shrug. An inoperative component becomes manageable. Piece by piece, the abnormal dresses itself as routine. Then one night, the routine takes off its mask and shows its teeth. For Brazil, the crash cut deep because it touched several nerves at once. It struck in the middle of a national debate about aviation safety and public trust. It happened at the busiest domestic airport in the country, in the largest city in South America, in a place everybody knew. It turned an evening commute corridor into a burn scar. It made the words wet and slippery sound less like a weather report and more like a verdict. The city itself became part of the testimony. There is also something particularly haunting about the physical symbol at the center of it all. That little thrust lever keeps returning to the mind, a small metal object under a human hand, so modest, so ordinary, and yet it became the hinge between a normal landing and a fireball. We like to imagine that great tragedies arrive through grand gestures. Often they do not. Often they arrive through inches, through a handle not fully moved, through one incomplete action, meeting a system that has no spare forgiveness left. In the aftermath, the official accountability process began. The final findings did not point to one single cause, because one single cause would have been too convenient for everyone except the dead. Instead, the record described a layered failure, the incorrect lever position, the absence of proper spoiler and braking logic, the crew stress, the company's organizational weaknesses, the airport's runway and safety margin problems, and the regulators' failures to close known gaps before the runway claimed the cost of delay in human lives. Safety changes followed, though, as always, they arrived after the blood. Procedures for wet runway operations and thrust lever handling were reinforced. Training and standardization received more attention. The warning logic for improper thrust settings during landing has become urgent. The runway itself eventually received the grooving and drainage improvements it should have had before reopening. None of that can be called victory. Safety improvements after a disaster are never triumphs. They are apologies translated into engineering, manuals, and concrete. Years later, Congonhas also received something else it had long lacked, a real arresting safety measure at the ends. The airport was fitted with REMAS beds and engineered materials arrestor systems. Let us explain that. They are made of crushable material designed to break under an aircraft's landing gear, absorbing energy and slowing the aircraft quickly when there is no room for a long overrun. It is not glamorous technology. It is humble, practical mercy built where the runway once offered almost none. That matters because it changes the moral geometry of the place. Before, a jet overrunning the runway at Congonhas was almost immediately negotiating with embankments, roads, and buildings. Now there is at least some engineered buffer, some deliberate attempt to keep a mistake from becoming a massacre. It does not erase the debt of Flight 3054. Nothing can. But it does mean the airport finally began treating the possibility of overrun as something to be contained, not merely feared and then endured. Still, the deepest lesson of the story does not live only in the airport upgrades. It lives in the sequence itself. The airplane was not out of control in the sky. It was not approaching chaos. It reached the runway and stabilized. That is what makes the disaster so haunting. It shows how a modern catastrophe can bloom after outsiders think the danger has already passed. The hardest part of the flight should have been behind them. Instead, the runway became the place where every buried weakness stood up at once. And this is where I return to the human heart of it. The captain was not a cartoon villain. The first officer was not a decorative victim of circumstance. They were professionals inside a trap, partly built by their own actions and partly built around them over time. To say that honestly is not to excuse the error. It is to respect reality. Human beings make mistakes. Systems are supposed to catch them. That night, too many of the catching mechanisms had already been weakened, delayed, or left unfinished. There is a quiet arrogance in every society that waits for disaster before honoring its own warnings. We see it in roads, bridges, hospitals, mines, ports, and yes, airports. People complain, workers report, small incidents happen, rules are drafted, improvements are discussed. Then somebody decides it can wait a little longer because the traffic must keep moving, the budget is tight, the schedule is crowded, the optics are bad, and the crisis is manageable. That word again, manageable, until the city pays the funeral invoice. So if you ask what really destroyed Flight 3054, the answer is larger than a cockpit and smaller than an ideology. It was not just rain, not just one lever, not just one captain. It was a whole corridor of tolerated fragility, a wet runway with unfinished defenses, a stressed national aviation system, a company expanding at a punishing speed, a crew is carrying an unusual cockpit dynamic, a technical procedure vulnerable to human habit, a machine that did not shout the right warning loudly enough at the right time. And if you ask why the story still clings to people who were not even there, it is because it violates our sense of when danger is supposed to happen. We are prepared to fear takeoff in bad weather. We are prepared to fear storms, turbulence, lightning, smoke, and things falling from the sky. But a landing that appears normal and then turns into a catastrophe on the ground feels like betrayal. The world had already offered the illusion of survival, then it snatched it back in seconds. That rainy runway in São Paulo has become more than a place in memory. It is almost a parable now, a narrow strip between routine and reckoning, between a system saying keep going and reality saying not like this, between the confidence of modern transport and the old truth that machines still bow in the end to friction, discipline, weather, and human timing. No amount of polished airline branding can charm those forces. They keep their own ledger and they do not care about public relations. So let us answer the question we began with. How do you touch down correctly without stopping? You do it when the landing is only the last chapter of a longer failure, when the runway is wet and less honest than it looks, when one thrust lever remains where it should not, when the wings keep carrying too much lift, when the brakes do not get the grip they need, when one engine still pushes forward, when the diagnosis arrives a few seconds late, when the city begins, the safety margin ends. And the most haunting thought is this: the truth was not completely hidden. Pieces of it were already lying in plain sight before the crash. The slippery reputation, the missing grooves, the recent overrun, the inoperative reverser, the old procedures, hidden risks, the strained system. None of those fragments alone forced the disaster. Together, they formed a map. But nobody held the whole map firmly enough before the aircraft reached the runway. History can be merciless like that. It punishes scattered awareness as if it were ignorance. That is why Flight 3054 should not be remembered as a sensational mystery or a tale about cursed machines. It should be remembered as a warning about what happens when local knowledge, technical lessons, and institutional responsibility fail to meet in time. The street below remembered, the runway remembered, the people who had spoken up remembered. And after the fire, the country had no choice but to remember too. Memory arrived late, but it arrived carrying the names of 199 dead. So when you picture that night, do not picture only the flames. Picture the rain shining on the runway. Picture the city lights under the embankment. Picture two pilots trying to understand a problem that had already begun racing ahead of their words. Picture one small metal lever sitting in the wrong place while a whole system's unfinished business closed in around it. Then tell me, in the comments, which detail stays with you most. The wet runway, the missing grooves, the words, no spoilers, or that final terrible truth that the plane landed first and died after. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.